everyone. Welcome back to Module 4 Glossary once again. Today we will continue discussing the terms associated with literary criticism. Today we will begin with the ambiguity. Became popular after the publication of the book 7 Types of Ambiguity by William Emerson. Ambiguity is an idea or situation that can be understood in more than one way. This causes a vagueness. Vagueness means lack of clarity or confusion in the meaning. This happens when two or more alternative meanings are blended into one. There will also be contradiction in the meaning. So ambiguity. What do you understand by ambiguity? Ambiguity is a statement or idea that can be understood in more than one way. So as a result, it causes a vagueness or confusion in the meaning. Such a statement or idea or situation can be called ambiguous because various meanings will come out of it. Sometimes meanings will be contradictory, opposite to each other. So such a statement or situation is called ambiguity. So the word became popular after the publication of the book 7 Types of Ambiguity by William Emerson. So in poetry, some poets deliberately bring ambiguity as a figure of speech. So now coming to the negative capability. Negative capability is a critical term which was first used by the Romantic poet John Keats in 1817. What was the meaning of it? It was used to designate, it was used to mean the capacity or ability of the greatest writers to pursue, to follow a vision of artistic beauty, even when it leads them to intellectual uncertainty. So it is an ability followed by many great writers to follow a vision of beauty, artistic beauty, even when that vision leads them to intellectual confusion, intellectual uncertainty. It is a writer's ability to accept uncertainties, mysteries, doubts without getting worried about fact and reason. Keats observed that Shakespeare had this ability enormously, largely. So it is an ability of the writer to accept uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, etc., without worrying about fact or reason. I will explain further. Writing about things that are not factual, supernatural, mysteries, without worrying about their logic. This is actually negative capability. To be more specific, യുക്തികൾക്ക് അതീതമായ കാര്യങ്ങളെക്കുറിച്ച് ചിന്തിക്കാനും അവ സാധ്യമാണോ എന്ന് വ്യാകുലപ്പെടാതെ അവയെക്കുറിച്ച് എഴുതാനുമുള്ള കഴിവ്. ഹാരി പോട്ടർ കഥകളുടെ കാര്യമെടുക്കുക. യഥാർത്ഥ ജീവിതത്തിൽ സാധ്യമല്ലാത്തത് പലതും അത്തരം കഥകളിൽ കാണാം. കാർ പറന്നു പോവുക, മനുഷ്യൻ പറക്കുക തുടങ്ങിയ കാര്യങ്ങൾ. സോ എബിലിറ്റി ഓഫ് എ റൈറ്റർ ടു റൈറ്റ് അബൌട്ട് improbable things without worrying about their possibility. This is called കഥയിൽ ചോദ്യമില്ല എന്ന് നമ്മൾ പറയുന്നത് പോലെയുള്ള കാര്യങ്ങൾ. The the ability of writers to use such situations are called situation is called negative capability. So read it once again and you will get it. It was used to mean the capacity of greatest writers to pursue a vision of artistic beauty, even though it leads them to intellectual uncertainty. It is a writer's ability to accept uncertainties, mysteries, doubts without getting worried about fact and reason. So, evaluating a classic. You might have heard about the word classic, a classic work of literature, classic work, a classic movie, etc. A classic is a work of art that stood the test of time and culture. Stood the test of time and culture means even after a very long time, if a particular work written uh, years ago is relevant, then we can say that that work is a classic. Matthew Arnold said that a work of literature is a classic if it belongs to the class of very best. If it is belonging to the class of very best, we can call it a classic. According to T.S. Eliot, the classic stature of a work can be determined only in a historical perspective. Historical perspective. That means a work which is acceptable in one period of history will not be acceptable in another period of history. So it is all depending upon the period in which we live, he says. So that is the opinion of T.S. Eliot about a classic. And Neoclassicism. Neo means new. Neoclassicism. Neoclassicism is a movement in Western art and culture. It is called a neoclassic because this movement showed high preference towards the ideals of classicism. Classicism means Greek, Roman writers, their works, their rules and regulations of writing, all these are together called classicism. So, neoclassical writers showed high respect or preference towards ideals of classicism. According to neoclassicists, classical writers, and especially the Romans, had established and perfected the important literary genres of all time. So neoclassicists, they respected, they followed the rules and regulations followed by the ancient classical Greek Roman writers. Neoclassical age in English literature extended from 1660 to 1785. So that is a question can be asked why neoclassical criticism is called neoclassical, because neo means new. These people were new, but still they followed the ancient classical rules. Now, features of English romantic poems. The salient important features of uh, romantic poems include high imagination. Romantic poets had high imagination, love for nature. You know that William Wordsworth is a nature poet. Other romantic poets like John Keats, Coleridge, all these writers were nature lovers. Spontaneity. Spontaneity means something that comes out of our mind all on a sudden, without uh, without being planned. Love for the past. These people loved the life in the past. Romantics. So they wrote about love for the past in their poems. Simplicity in expression. Simplicity. Most of the romantic poets wrote in a simple manner. A revolutionary zeal, revolutionary energy, excitement can be seen in romantic poems. Then individualism, a preference for the person, the individual, Vyakti, that can be seen in English romantic poems. Then a preference for supernaturalism, the presence of ghosts, uh, and other supernatural entities, something that are not natural. All these were included in romantic poems. Then subjectivity. Subjectivity means personal. Most of the romantic poems were personal in nature. Then a preference for medievalism. Medievalism means something that is associated with the Middle Age, medieval period in the history. Then love for freedom and predominance of lyricism. Most of the romantic poems were lyric, musical. So there is a long list. Please note down one by one and study them. I'll read once again. Romantic salient features of romantic poems include high imagination, love for nature, spontaneity, love for the past, simplicity in expression, revolutionary zeal, individualism, supernaturalism, subjectivity, medievalism, love for freedom, and predominance of lyricism. You can make an anagram in order to study this easily by taking the first alphabet or and bringing them together just like Webg, or find a convenient anagram for that. Then features of Renaissance humanism. The word humanism was used by German scholars in 18th century to denote classical knowledge, which they called as Renaissance humanism. So this word humanism was first used by German scholars in the 18th century. What they meant by Renaissance humanism, what they meant by humanism was classical knowledge, which they called Renaissance humanism. Renaissance humanism inspired the study of classical scholars as urged by Petrarch. Petrarch is a famous poet of the time. So Petrarch urged that the classical scholars should be studied. The study of classical scholars also resulted in the progress of science and reason. So these are some of the features of Renaissance humanism, that they are inspired by the study of classical scholars urged by Petrarch. It resulted in the progress of science and reason, etc. Then about realism in literature. You know what is realism? You may say that that film is realistic, that book is realistic, something like that. So realism is the accurate and minute depiction of people, things, and events in literature and arts. So minute and accurate representation of depiction of people, things, and events in literature and arts. The term realism is applied to literature in two different ways. One, to identify a 19th century movement in writing novels, which included Balzac, George Eliot, and others. Two, to designate a recurring mode of representing human life and experience in literature. There are two ways in which realism is used in literature. One is a realistic movement in 19th century literature, that is in novel. The writers included were Balzac and George Eliot. That is one. Two, realism is used to talk about a repeating mode of representing human life and experience in literature. See, this is what we said in the first line, designating the human life and experiences accurately in literature. So this is an important question because it is often asked, what are the two ways in which realism is applied in literature? One is the 19th century movement in writing novels. The second one is representation of human life and experience in literature. Then what is magical realism? Magical realism is a subgenre, a subcategory within realism. It is a style of writing that represents a realistic view of the modern world, while also adding magical elements. So, magical elements will be present in a realistic world. That type of representation is called magical realism. Some writers who employ this method are Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Borges, Juan Rulfo, and others. See the pronunciation, it's Borges, Juan Rulfo. So, that is magical realism. Magical realism is quite different from fantasy because in magical realist works, most of the representation will be realistic to life, and occasionally some magical things happen in life. Then fantasy is detached from life from the very beginning to end. An example of magical realist film is the Malayalam film Amen, in which magical things also happens along with the realistic events. You can see in that movie that angels were sitting on top of the houses. Such things are magical. At the same time, the movie is realistic as well. Then, naturalism. Naturalism is something like realism. Naturalism was a late 19th century movement in literature that was originated in France. Naturalism uses techniques of scientific and objective inquiry in the depiction of the ordinary, as opposed to the idealistic and supernatural treatment of subjects by Romanticism. So, naturalism was formed as a reaction against Romanticism. Romanticism portrayed idealistic life, supernatural treatment of subjects. However, naturalism was quite different. Naturalism used techniques of scientific and objective inquiry in the depiction of ordinary life. Some important works in this mode are John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, the French novelist Emile Zola's Nana are some of the works in this tradition. Important factor is this: naturalism uses techniques of scientific and objective inquiry in depiction. So it is formed as an opposition against the idealistic and supernatural treatment of subjects by Romanticism. And finally, symbolism. Symbolism is a literary movement that originated with a group of French poets in the late 19th century, like Charles Baudelaire, Arthur Rimbaud, and Paul Verlaine. So it was started by a group of French poets in 19th century. These French poets were Charles Baudelaire, Arthur Rimbaud, Paul Verlaine. Then symbolist artists sought to express individual emotional experience through the subtle and suggestive use of highly symbolized language. So these people tried to express individual emotional experience through a symbolized language. Symbolized language means symbolism involves the use of symbols in literary works to signify ideas and qualities, giving them symbolic meanings that are different from literal sense. See, use of symbols means you can say that this the bird owl is regarded as a symbol of evil or a symbol of something bad. So, using one thing, bringing together or comparing one object with another thing so that its significance is doubled. This approach, the approach like this can be called as symbolism. We may say that a rose is a symbol of love, like that. So, thus we have come to the end of this glossary. So I have carefully selected these terms. So instead of looking into the vast textbook, You can easily study this selected uh, literary terms that I have discussed in the last two classes. So, beginning, I will tell you once again the questions that you should study for your examination in this glossary modules: rasa and how it is accomplished, three constituent of elements of rasa, which is important, which should be studied as a paragraph, the only one. Essays will not be coming from this area. The rest of the questions are in the 2 mark area: Dhvani, Vyanjana, role of Alankara in poetry, Aujitya, relation between Alankara and Rasa, catharsis or purgation, mimesis according to Plato and Aristotle, objective correlative, ambiguity, negative capability, evaluating a classic, neoclassicism, features of English romantic poems, features of Renaissance humanism, realism in literature, magical realism, naturalism, symbolism, etc. So we are stopping here. Thank you.